part of the Earglue Media family of podcasts.
You're listening to Petticoats and Poppies.
History Girls at the Movies.
Welcome to Petticoats and Poppies, History Girls at the Movies. We're your hosts, Maggie and
Nicole.
Welcome back to the last episode of 2020. I think I speak for both of us when I say that we are so thankful for those of you who have been with us along this journey this year. Today's episode feels like the perfect film to wrap up the year, given the message that the story is about. But before we get into the main episode, let's talk about our holiday plans. Nicole, what are you up to for the holidays?
Well, this is obviously a bit of a weird holiday in that a lot of the normal things that I would do for Christmas I can't do because of the pandemic and because of, being responsible and everything.
Mm-hmm.
I've been having some Zoom calls with people. We had our Next Best Picture, which is one of the sites that I write for, Zoom party the other night where we all got on a Zoom call together. It was very fun. I've been Zooming some friends. My friend Patricia, who I know listens to this, we had a lovely couple of hours Zoom the other night. I know that my friend Lexi and I, who guested on the podcast earlier this year, we are waiting for my present to reach her, and then we're going to get on Skype and open our presents to each other together.
Aww.
And we're going to watch Santa Claus is Coming to Town together because we both love it. But as far as, family plans go, it's going to be a kind of quiet Christmas. I'm at my parents' house now. Luckily, I live alone, so I've been able to sort of quarantine bubble with my parents and my sister, and I only live now that I've moved, about 10 to 15 minutes away from them, so I'm at my parents' house for the next 2 weeks, and I get to spend time with my sister, who's 17. We're going to watch Little Women, and we're going to watch Frozen 2, one on Christmas Eve, one on Christmas Day. We haven't chosen what yet. And we're doing a lot of drive-by visits to my family because my mom's whole family lives in North Carolina. So we're doing a lot of driving by, putting gifts down on the porch and standing out in the yard while we talk to them while they're on their porch, that sort of thing, so that we can at least see them, even if it's from afar, and, give presents to each other. So, it's going to be different. But yeah. I'm still very excited. And this is our big achievement, I swear, of the whole 2020. Normally, we are that kind of family who is still wrapping presents on Christmas Eve.
Oh, gosh.
I can't remember a year that we weren't still wrapping presents on Christmas Eve. And this year, we had all of the gifts wrapped and under the tree by the 19th.
Oh, wow.
So,
impressive.
Yeah, we've really stepped up our game. I mean, that is the one blessing of quarantine. There's nowhere to go, and we don't have to clean the house for the normal Christmas Eve party that we throw. So we were able to get some other stuff like that done. We've been doing a lot of baking. So what about you, Maggie?
So we are usually on holiday for Christmas. So this has been a very, very strange experience. Usually we don't do Christmas decorations. We don't do a Christmas tree. We don't do presents. Still not really doing presents. We have a Christmas tree though. We actually bought a brand new Christmas tree. And I bought a bunch of new ornaments, instead of having to deal with going up into our dormer and finding some of our antique Christmas ornaments and stuff. We just start it fresh. But my Christmas Day plans are to watch Wonder Woman 1984 again.
Of course.
Dear listeners, if you are waiting on bated breath to know whether or not I got approved to watch Wonder Woman 1984, I did. So I will be watching that early and then rewatching it on Christmas Day. And I mean, I guess on Christmas Day, I'm just going to watch that. I'm going to rewatch We Can Be Heroes and then the Disney Gallery Mandalorian specials. So it's basically a Pedro Pascal Christmas for me. And that's my plan. We've made some candy. We made chocolate coconut cherry balls and some pecan pasties. But that's about it. Very low-key holidays. That's how I like it. Not big on the holidays, to be honest.
And I'm a huge Christmas person, which you might guess from my personality.
It's so funny. You and I are the complete opposite when it comes to holidays.
We are. It's interesting too, though, because we're not a very religious family at all, but we go all out for Christmas. And I do think part of that is that we're quite close to my mom's family and they all live within an hour of us. So we typically were with family on like all of Christmas Eve, and then we typically spend Christmas Day just ourselves. Ever since my grandmother passed, she used to come over and spend Christmas Day with us. But we go really hard for the holidays, and like that, I think that's both sides of my family. So I like really got a double dose of it. I love Christmas. It's Christmas Eve is like my favorite day of the year. My second favorite day of the year is Christmas. My third favorite day is normally the Tony Awards. So I'm glad that I'm at least getting something this year. And it's a different Christmas, but I think it's one that we're gonna remember. So I'm
Yeah.
sure someday I will, tell my kids or whatever about my quarantine Christmas.
So I guess that's a great segue into what we're talking about today.
Absolutely. A big part of my family's Christmas traditions revolve around watching movies. We have movies that we watch every year, some of which are, sort of overtly Christmas themed. Like, we always have to watch Eloise at Christmas time, and White Christmas is two of our favorites. And some of which are more like we have a tradition. We always watch When Harry Met Sally sometime around New Year's Eve or the day before. But one of our recent favorites is actually the movie that we're talking about today. We're going to talk about The Man Who Invented Christmas, which is a movie that came out in 2017. I think it really flew under the radar here in the US. It was a lot more popular in the UK, obviously, even though, funny enough, it's an Irish and Canadian film, which I found very funny.
Yes.
Like how, but I've got like, I'll put up an Instagram post with some things that I'm going to mention in this episode, whenever this episode comes out. And one of those is that I remember there were signs everywhere in the tube stations, advertising this movie over there. And then I got back to the US for Christmas and everybody was like, what are you talking about? What movie? But it was directed by, and I'm sorry if I say this wrong, but, I think it's Bharat Nalluri, and written by Suzanne Coyne. And it's based on the book by, Les Standiford, which I actually have sitting next to me. I'm about halfway through the book. It's really good. It's a nonfiction book about Dickens, around the time that he was writing A Christmas Carol. And so that's what the movie also follows, is sort of Charles Dickens and his artistic process, I guess, writing A Christmas Carol. It stars Dan Stevens, Christopher Plummer, Simon Callow, and Jonathan Pryce. And it's an interesting film. It starts in America in 1842, before kind of flashing forward to October of 1843. And I think, and I feel like this is pretty echoed by what I've read about the movie from other reviewers and other historians. While there's definitely a lot of liberties taken in terms of specifics, it's actually a remarkably accurate film in terms of big picture type stuff, which I'm excited to talk about a bit more with you today, Maggie. But I think it actually is a really good film, and it's very weird that we don't have more movies about Charles Dickens. So it's one that I would be very comfortable with the idea of this being shown in schools to kids, if they're trying to find like a Christmas tie-in movie for a history class or something.
Yeah. I mean, it was such a fun movie to watch. I really enjoyed it. I did not see it when it first came out, back in 2017. I think I had meant to see it, and it just like something else was happening in 2017, and honestly, I can't remember what it was that came out that year, and I saw that instead. But watching this morning, I cried. It really just like it hit in all the right places. Christmas Carol is one of my favorite books and one of my favorite musicals. And so like the whole time I was watching this, and there was like certain lines in the movie that, are referencing the book that then also references the musical. I kept singing them like link by link, and like charity and abundance, and just like so many little things, because I've been in Christmas Carol the musical, and then I worked on it 3 times, and just like it never fails to make me cry, like thinking about Scrooge's like journey. And like I really liked how they reflected what Dickens was experiencing through what he was writing into Scrooge, which is also like obviously taking great liberties, because this isn't exactly how he came up with A Christmas Carol, but it was nice, and it really worked for like a heartwarming Christmas movie that was a slight twist on the regular Christmas Carol story. I will say I laughed when he went to get the art from Leech, because literally my first thought was, "Dear Andre, what a splendid party! A prologue from Frank, you here?" Because I was like, "It's Andre."
Oh, I love that.
And that's just like that. Yeah, that just says so much about me. But I will say that I'm not a big fan of Dickens, the man. Um, I will never forgive him for trying to send his wife to an asylum, and that's just me being very petty. But I respect him for what he has been able to create, because I think that a book like A Christmas Carol, which, as we saw in those closing kind of end notes on the film, did help improve like generosity and the sense of the Christmas spirit. And so, I mean, we can thank him for that, but he was okay.
Yeah, I have a very weird and complicated relationship with Dickens. Whenever I lived in London, I spent a year volunteering at the Charles Dickens Museum every week. And the Dickens Museum is the house that Charles and his wife and their first 3 children lived in from about 1837 to about 1840. So kind of just before the time that this film is set. And the Dickens that we see in this film is much more the Dickens that I'm familiar with from working there than that of like the other main Dickens movie, which is The Invisible Woman. And Dan Stevens does look remarkably like a young Charles Dickens in this. Like if you look up a portrait of young Dickens and then you watch this movie, it's kind of uncanny. They did a very good job in that. And I think Dickens was a very complicated man.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this film actually does a good job of sort of touching on, without going too deep into psychoanalyzing him, sort of the weird things in his childhood that led to some of his oddness as a man and some of his issues, I think, with people. And, you know, particularly it's a hard thing because whenever I worked at the museum, people would sometimes come up and ask me like, oh, like, do you think Dickens was a good person? And I was like, well, that's a really complicated question to answer. Obviously he treated his wife, Catherine, abominably. But at the same time, he did have some, like, his stances on women in general weren't necessarily bad for a man of that era.
No. In fact, I just watched a documentary from Alice Roberts, who's a British historian and anthropologist, and she was talking about his great respect for Elizabeth Gaskell during the oh my gosh, I'm blanking on that period of time, but when things were changing and they were starting to enlist rules and stuff about factories, and that he was a big supporter of her, which is just so interesting. He's a very complicated man.
Very. And I think, you know, he also was incredibly progressive in his social attitudes for the day and did a lot of, you know, activism and philanthropy that I think really changed things in England at the time, and then that trickled to the US as well. And so I think that you kind of can't ignore all of that. And obviously also, he was in many ways like a literary genius. You know, however you feel about his work now, the way in which he popularized the novel, I think is really remarkable. And I think it's also kind of hard for us to even conceptualize just how famous he was in his time. But, you know, it is complicated, but I really like this movie because I think that it captures, like, how eccentric of a man he was really well. Like, he was very into his own image, very into his clothing. Basically, it was kind of a fop. He was
a big fop.
He was very particular about being interrupted while he was writing and would, like, fly off the handle. And I think, you know, there are some historians who even have suggested that perhaps Charles Dickens was bipolar, and that's why there is this sort of extreme
I can see that.
2 sides of him, which obviously, like, you can't diagnose someone once they're dead. But, you know, he definitely had sort of this side of him that would come out. Yeah. And I also think, like, it does a good job of showing, without getting too swept up in it and losing the story that it's trying to tell, how incredibly insecure he was about his childhood and about his father and about what had happened to him as a young man, which I'll go into in a bit. Obviously, the movie takes a lot of creative liberties about where his inspiration for A Christmas Carol comes from. The maid, Tara, is a fictional character, but there's really nothing, like, important in it that I feel is inaccurate. There's nothing that I feel like someone would come away from it thinking about Charles Dickens that I think is particularly inaccurate. I don't know if you would agree with that, but
I would agree. I mean, they definitely made it clear that he had difficult relationship with his wife, which at first I thought they were going to make it too like lovey-dovey, and I was like, don't
Yeah.
you dare, because they had a weird relationship, and they definitely touched on it without being like, we're gonna make this Christmas movie really sad.
Right. And I think it's appropriate considering, like, at the time in which this is set, they were still on decent terms with each other.
Yeah.
Like, I think, like, it's a better movie about Charles Dickens than, say, Becoming Jane is about Jane Austen in terms of historical accuracy.
Yeah, I would agree.
In terms of movies about writers, I think it's a fairly good one. I mean, hey, I think it's probably a better movie about Charles Dickens than Vita and Virginia is about Virginia Woolf.
100%.
So I think that, there is that. I think the movie has some issues with tone. I think it also, like, gets a little meandering in the middle section.
I was going to say it definitely wanders.
Yes. I think that, they could have tightened up that middle section a lot and made it. I'm not saying I got bored in it, but I can see where people could get bored in it, if you know what I mean. If they're not big, people who are very interested in Dickens like we are.
Yes.
I think what's really fun for me is that obviously the house that we see in the movie wouldn't have been 48 Doughty Street, where the Dickens Museum is today, but it does look remarkably like it in its decorations and its style, which I think is great because it really feels like a Dickens residence, and it feels like it encapsulates not just Victorian style, but also Catherine Dickens style in particular.
Yes.
And I do think this actually is one of my favorite movies about writing and about a writer. And it's a really lovely Christmas film. I think it's a great addition to, obviously, everyone's seen like 40,000 versions of A Christmas Carol. I literally just reviewed a version that one of the local theaters has put on. But this is a little bit of a twist on that, and I think it's really fun.
Yes. Oliver Twist.
Oh my God.
But to go back to what you just said about this being a really good film about writers, also, like, as a writer, I found it fascinating to watch what goes on in my head on screen, because that, like, characters arguing, characters being like, I don't like what you're doing with me, is so accurate. I was like, oh, cool, I'm not insane. Well, I might be if I'm a lot like Dickens, but it was great to see that, because you people, so often people talk about that experience, like when they're writing, like, and then the characters were like standing there and like trying to figure out what they wanted me to do with them next, and people just look at you like you're crazy, and I can be like, just watch The Man Who Invented Christmas. That's the exact, like, that's it.
Yeah, basically. I mean,
they wake me up in the middle of the night and they're like, hey, that thing you did yesterday, I don't like that.
Oh man. Well, I wanted to talk, obviously, for one of our topics today about Charles Dickens, and I thought that I would sort of talk about Dickens in his personal life leading up to the writing of A Christmas Carol, because that's sort of what pertains to this movie, and I didn't want to try and talk about his entire life. And I'm sure that people know a fair amount about Dickens, like the writer, so I thought that I would focus more on Dickens, the man. But Dickens was born on February 7th, 1812 in Landport, England, and his family moved around a lot when he was a child, but he was a writer, activist, and philanthropist, I think are sort of the things that we would call him today. As we see in the film, when Charles was a young boy, his father, John Dickens, was taken to debtor's prison, and while eventually the rest of the family went to stay with him, Charles was sent to work at Warren's blacking warehouse at the age of 12, and he was taken out of school, and this really weighed heavily on him. He had a very difficult time there, and it seems to have really affected him for the rest of his life. The family, even though Charles's grandparents had actually been servants, they were fairly middle class before this occurred, and so he felt it very strongly, I think, his demotion in life, sort of. And he was very secretive about what had happened for his entire life. He only really was open about it with his wife and his friend, John Forster, who we see in the film. And it was sort of something that he, I think, felt very ashamed of. And he definitely didn't want people to know. When his father was released from prison, because he had actually, Charles's grandmother had died, and so his dad inherited money and he was able to pay his debts. His mother supported Charles continuing to work at the factory. And some historians think this is part of where, like, Charles Dickens' weird relationship with women starts, is that he resented his mother for that. And so he comes to have these weird ideas about how, like, the father should be the head of the family and should, rule the family. And it may come from his mom having that opinion. But he is eventually sent back to school for a few years, and then he becomes a law clerk, and then becomes a journalist. He goes through this period where he's, like, really obsessed with going to the theater, and he loves the theater his entire life, but there's this, like, couple year period where he claims that he went to the theater every single day. Which, like, it's a mood. That was me when I lived in London.
I was going to say,
really,
Nicole,
yeah.
Are we sure you're not Charles Dickens?
Don't
Woman
worry.
in White?
Like, the conversation.
Was it Venus in Fur?
Both of those. The Grinning Man. There were shows I saw way too much. We used to joke a lot when I worked at the Dickens Museum that Charles Dickens was exactly the sort of artsy, let's see, I'm trying to think of a cleaner version of this word. Artsy boy that I would be into, even though he was bad for me. But he really wanted to be an actor, and at one point he actually had an audition for a Covent Garden acting troupe that he missed because he got sick. And it's funny to think, like, where might the world be had his acting career actually taken off?
Yeah,
but
seriously.
He does eventually start writing stories, which are published serially, and he writes first under the pen name Boz, before switching over to publishing under his own name. And his first big success is the Pickwick Papers, which even people who aren't familiar with Dickens might recognize from the book Little Women, because it's discussed in that book as well. He's very funny as a writer. It is true, as we see in the film, that his characters often appeared to him fully formed, and he would talk about them to other people as though they were real people. This is one of my favorite things that I learned at the house, is he kept a mirror near his desk, and while he was writing, he would go and make faces in it and, like, try and act out what he was trying to write to be able to describe it better.
Yep, sounds about right.
We've hinted at his wife, Catherine. He had an earlier woman that he was in love with and wanted to marry, but that didn't work out. And so he ends up becoming friends with the Hogarth family. They have 3 daughters, Catherine, Mary, and Georgiana, all 3 of which Dickens ends up being very close with in different ways. He marries Catherine Hogarth in 1836. They're both in their early 20s. And the two were actually very happy early on in their relationship, even though they would come to have a very rocky and very difficult relationship later in life and eventually would separate. They had 10 children. It is true, as we see in the movie, that Charles did have very odd nicknames for each of the kids. You can kind of see in the way that he talks about them. He seemed to like them when they were babies, and the older they grew, liked them less. Yeah, not the best dad, but for a Victorian dad, not the worst. I think by the standards of the day, he's not a bad father. Just wasn't all that interested in them a lot of the time. At the point that we see the couple in the film, Catherine is pregnant with her 5th child, and that's around the time that their relationship really starts to sour. There is famously the quote, I think it's around this time, that he refers to her as a donkey, which ain't great.
Yeah.
But I think what we see in the film, where their relationship is starting to be rocky, is sort of accurate for the time. And I think also part of the pressure of this is the family was in difficult financial straits at the time. Because they were a little spendy, and Dickens had been so successful in his early career and then had a series of flops. And so they kind of got used to a station in life, and then maybe weren't actually at the level to keep that up. But it definitely a rocky relationship there. Though what I think they show in the film is accurate to 1843 specifically. He was a very complicated man, a very eccentric man, but very well liked. People, both the public and people that he knew, really liked him. I think he must have been very charming, which I think is kind of true to how Dan Stevens plays him in this movie. There is something a bit magnetic about him, even as strange as he is. He's definitely an artsy type.
Oh, he's very strange. Which, brings us to costumes in a very roundabout way. So the costumes were designed by, I really hope that I pronounce her name correctly, Leonie Prendergast, who also did the costumes on the popular series Ripper Street, and she is also doing the costumes in the series that is upcoming called Miss Scarlet and the Duke, which I'm very excited about coming to the US because it has one of my favorite actors in it. So I was very excited to see that connection. Victorian costumes are quite hard to mess up. Just because there is such a vast collection of them at pretty much any film production company, especially in the UK. I tried to go through and see if I recognize any costumes from other movies that came out either before or after this one, and I didn't readily recognize any. That's not to say that I'm sure somebody has a blog post out there somewhere, because we all know that Britain loves to recycle costumes. But this was truly a colorful spectacle of Victorian costuming, which you obviously want if you are tackling something like A Christmas Carol, even if it's kind of a roundabout way of presenting Christmas Carol. And it was a really visually stunning movie. I didn't find that any costumes specifically stood out as a representation of anything. I did like the way that he, was like, oh, if I dress like this, people will give me money, which was neat and very, very accurate. Dress for the part and you'll get what you want. I loved his cravats. They were fantastic. And especially talking about this idea of Dickens being a bit of a fop, very fitting for his character. I was also a really big fan of his wife's plaid dress that she wore, particularly the smocking details at the front of it. It was just a very beautiful dress, and I kind of wish I had seen that dress the entire film because it was just my favorite dress, and I kind of want one that looks just like that. But I really liked how they brought some of the characters to life. I really like the costume design for Marley, which is obviously very accurate to the drawings of A Christmas Carol, which are in the original edition, but also very accurate to how that character, as well as, the Ghost of Christmas Present, and those ghosts were fairly accurate to what you see on any stage across America and the US and around the world, and what you see in the Kelsey Grammer Christmas Carol. It's very stereotypical, because Christmas Carol is this bigger than life, everybody knows of it kind of, production. So it was nice to see that even Dickens' mind had those character designs that worked. But overall, if I had to give this a grade, I'd give it a solid 9.5 for costuming.
I really like the costumes in this too. I think they're really fun. I will say, when the winter that it was coming out, we actually had some of these costumes at the Dickens Museum. And I will put those in my Instagram post. I got a couple of photos of them. We had a handful of the children's costumes, and one of Dan Stevens, and one of, I think it was Jonathan Pryce's, and I believe it was one of the women's, but it wasn't one of Catherine's. I want to say it might have been, the family maid's costume, maybe. But I know I have a selfie with one of Dan Stevens' costumes because it was very cool that we just had them sort of sitting around the museum in different rooms to sort of demonstrate, to people coming in what people in the house would have looked like, what they would have been wearing, but also to advertise the movie a bit. I really like these costumes. Like you said, there's nothing super standout amongst most of them, but they're really lovely and really well done.
Mm-hmm.
So I also thought I'd just talk a bit about A Christmas Carol and sort of what we see in the film and what of that is correct. I think the film inflates the success of his American tour the year before and his opinion of the American people, who he was very disappointed in. He actually ended up canceling part of the tour because he was not having a good time, basically.
Well, if you think about the timing...
Right.
There's a lot going on.
Right. Well, and also, he was supposed to go down south, and it was summer months, and he was already, it is too hot here. And so he canceled part of the leg of the tour. But that is definitely a little bit inflated, but it is certainly true that the Dickens family was in financial trouble at the time that he wrote A Christmas Carol, because several of his works, including Martin Chuzzlewit, had flopped. And he, I think a lot of people were a bit worried about his future as a writer. And obviously, like I say that they flopped for Dickens. They didn't flop in comparison to a lot of other authors of the day. But A Christmas Carol was published on December 19th, 1843. Charles Dickens was 31 years old at the time, which I just find interesting because I feel like so often whenever we think about Dickens, we think about him as an older man. And it's just weird to think that he wasn't like that much older than you or I whenever he wrote this story.
I don't like thinking about that because, like, I have done nothing with it.
That's not true, but I totally understand that. I feel the same way. And it is true that Christmas wasn't a major holiday in Britain compared to, like, Easter or Boxing Day at this time. And it was really only celebrated in the countryside. And part of why Dickens himself was so into Christmas was because he had grown up partially in the countryside before they moved into the city. I will say, like, it's not just Dickens. Queen Victoria also had gotten married a few years earlier to the German Prince Albert. And Germany was very into Christmas. And so he was starting to bring his traditions, like having a Christmas tree, into the UK. And so those were sort of becoming very popular amongst the upper class. But Dickens did really help popularize this idea of Christmas having like a meaning and also celebrating it in towns and cities as well as out in the countryside. And I think, the film kind of shows us his sister Fanny's son, Henry Jr., who was a very sick and disabled child. And he was the inspiration for Tiny Tim, most people believe, as we kind of see in the film. I think Fanny Dickens Burnett is a really fascinating figure. She was very close to Charles, and she actually trained at the Royal Academy of Music as a musician before marrying John Burnett, who is sort of this evangelical activist. But in the story, in writing A Christmas Carol, Dickens was also sort of responding to the poor conditions that many children in the country lived in. The second report of the Children's Employment Commission had been published in February of that year. He also, not long before writing this, had gone up to Manchester, where his sister Fanny lived, because he had been asked to give a speech at an event where they were trying to raise money to sort of help the poverty-stricken people of Manchester. And it's
that's what I was just watching a documentary on yesterday.
Yeah, I was reading about it in the book that the movie's based on, and that obviously was like a big inspiration for writing this, because Dickens was very passionate about this idea that people had a responsibility to help the poor. And obviously you can see where a lot of that comes from, because he himself having experienced what he did as a child. He did in fact write this in 6 weeks. It's, I think, by far one of his shorter works that are famous. I think most of the works that we associate with him today are his longer pieces, whereas this is quite short. You really could get through it in an evening, I think, quite easily. He would take nighttime walks while he was writing this of like 15 to 20 miles around London, where he would come up with a log of the story, and then he would get back and write it down. And there are stories about how he would go on these walks, and they would sometimes have to send like policemen with him, because he would not pay attention to what kind of areas he was going through. And it was kind of the police of London were a little bit concerned about something happening to him.
Oh, Dickens.
Oh yeah. But he did get in a fight with his publishers, Chapman and Hall, about the failure of Martin Chuzzlewit. And so he decided to pay to publish A Christmas Carol himself, with the idea that he would get more of the profits of it, if it did well. There were all these issues with production. Like, he didn't like the olive end papers that they put in. He thought that they were drab. He said that they were not, so that they could go forward with. So they replaced them with these yellow end papers. But then he said it clashed with the title page, and that had to be redone. So there's all these like issues with it. But as we see in the movie, the first edition was this red cloth, gilt-edged book that he finally approved. And it actually was published on the 19th and sold out by Christmas Eve. And
remarkable. 13
editions have been released by the end of the following year, 1844. But despite these high sales, his profit was actually shockingly low because of the cost of printing them and because he had fronted that himself. So it wasn't like, even though the book did really well, and it actually was received really well critically, like it had mostly positive reviews, at the same time, it's not like it completely solved his financial issues or something. He started doing public readings of this story in 1849, and they were so popular that he kept doing them for years afterwards, and he loved nothing more than to do a public reading, which, you know, you can obviously trace that back to his original ambitions as an actor.
Mm-hmm.
The book has never been out of print. It's been translated into countless languages, and it's been adapted countless times for film, stage, radio, and even opera. So I think it is probably, I mean, wouldn't you say it's probably the most iconic Christmas story, aside from like the nativity story itself? And I think it's crazy to think about the fact that he came up with all of it in just 6 weeks.
Yeah, I mean, that's tremendously impressive.
Hate to admit it, but he did good.
Yeah. And I think that says a lot about when you have a story that you want to write and like you'll do anything to get it out, even if your publishers are like being annoying.
Absolutely.
So he definitely felt like this was a message that he wanted to like get across to people. So I give him props for that. Still won't forgive him. But we thought that it would be really nice, since it is the end of the year, to highlight a few museums that need your help. Obviously, 2020 has been really difficult for a lot of people, but the museum industry is definitely in trouble, and not just in the US, but around the world. So if you have any museums in your small town or in your city, or there is somewhere that you have visited at some point that you loved, look into helping them this holiday season by shopping in their gift shops or seeing if they have some way for you to give a donation. Even $5 goes a long way to keeping the lights on and keeping employees employed. But we thought it would be really nice to highlight 4 museums that matter to us.
So no one's going to be surprised. My first museum I'm going to talk about is the Dickens Museum in London. It is a really, really lovely small museum. Obviously, I volunteered there for a year, so I have a lot of love for it personally, but everyone that I know who I ever brought there also really enjoyed it. It's a lovely home. It's filled with a lot of items that belong to Dickens. Actually, like a remarkable amount of things that were his or are in some way related to him are there. Like, they have everything from, you know, a bunch of his papers to locks of his hair to the flower that was put on his coffin at his funeral, like everything that you could imagine. It is also the only Dickens home that is open to the public. There is another Dickens home that survives, Gad's Hill, but it's actually still in use as a school. So this is the only place that you can see Dickens stuff. And as such, they have, you know, basically every piece of furniture that is known to have belonged to the Dickens family, including his writing desk where he wrote most of his work. It's, I said earlier, but it is where he lived from 1837 to 1840. So it also is just a really good representation of an early Victorian home. Like, I think even if you're not all that interested in Charles Dickens as a person, it's a really interesting museum just because they were able to buy the house next to it at the time that they bought it. It actually is entirely open. There isn't a single room that you don't get to see into because all the offices and gift shop and all that kind of stuff is in the building next door, which is now interconnected. It is closed now that London is in Tier 4. It's kind of been yo-yoed back and forth this year with being closed and being opened as restrictions have changed. But they're running a lot of virtual programs. A great way to support the museum is to buy a ticket to a virtual program. They've got some very cool stuff on around Christmas. But also, I'm certain they're going to continue their virtual programming into the new year. They also have an online store, which has a lot of really cool stuff in it. And that's another good way to support a museum if you maybe don't feel like you're in a good place to make a donation. If you buy stuff from a museum shop, that's a really good way to support a museum. And they also, of course, do take donations, and they also do memberships. So it's a museum that's very near and dear to my heart. I know that Maggie also enjoys this museum a lot. And I know that they would,
one of my favorites.
Yeah, they would really appreciate your help and support because they actually
also the Foundling Museum, which is like right around the corner.
Yes,
is great as well.
And the Dickens Museum doesn't receive a lot of funding from the government. They really do run largely on donations and on ticket sales. And
Mhm.
it's also very cool in that, like, the Dickens family, Dickens descendants are still very involved. I once was at an event there and did not realize who I was talking to until someone told me afterwards that it was Mark Dickens. Uh, but all of the people involved, like Mark, that I've met are incredibly nice. And I just know that they would really appreciate your support, especially this time of year.
Yes. And then I wanted to highlight one that is in the US. The Mutter Museum at the College of Physicians of Philadelphia is one of my favorite museums. I did not get to actually go to it until 2 years ago, no, a year ago, when I was working in Philadelphia on a TV show and I had a day off and I finally got to go to the Mutter Museum, and it was everything that I thought it would be for like the last 20 years of my life. It is a beautiful museum with so much fantastic, cool history and science. I am a big fan of anatomical science, and this museum is just like phenomenal and like obviously also hurting. They had a huge grant planned this year, like a $25 million grant to do a complete like upgrade of the building because it is a historic building and is in need of some serious repairs, and everything essentially got canceled. You can find some articles about that back in May. There's a lot of concerns about being able to keep their docents on moving into the new year, as well as their employees. Just because it's the College of Physicians of Philadelphia does not mean that they have a large amount of funding. They do rely on donors. So if you are able to give them a donation, you can find that on their website. They also have a fantastic gift shop, and you can buy some really fun things. And this will definitely give away like my morbid sense of humor. So you can buy Plague Doctor cookie cutters, which I own. You can also buy anatomical tarot cards, which I also own. Bought both of those online to support the museum. And then they also have plush microbes and organs. So if you ever wanted to purchase like a plush tuberculosis petri dish, or a plush set of lungs, or a squishy heart, or a plush they have the clap. Check out their gift shop. You can get all of those things on there and you will not be sorry.
That's amazing.
It's so cute. Like, I never thought I'd be like, oh my god, look at this cute little plush TB.
I was hoping to get to go to Philadelphia this year before everything blew up, but it is one of the places that I really want to go at some point soon once we are allowed to travel again. And I definitely will have to make a stop by there whenever I do.
And then you had another museum you wanted to talk about as well,
Yes.
right?
I did. This is a museum that I've actually never been to in person, but I recently did a virtual program there, and it was really lovely. And it is Jane Austen's house in Chawton, England. It's the house that Jane Austen lived in for the last 8 years of her life, along with her mother, her sister, and her friend Martha Lloyd. And they have a lot of things related to Jane Austen and her life. And they've got some really lovely online programs. They also have like a completely virtual tour of it that you can kind of go through every room in the house. The Dickens Museum has the same. I got actually like very emotional yesterday looking at it. Because I miss it a lot. But I did a virtual tour that was guided with one of the people who work at the museum for Jane Austen's house recently, and it was very cool. Definitely one that I'd like to make it to in person at some point. But they have some roof damage right now that they're trying to fix. They need to put a new roof on the building, and that's obviously going to cost a lot. So for just $20 or £15, you can actually sponsor a roof tile, which is pretty cool. Obviously, you can also give more than that. They have a pretty lofty goal that they need to reach if they're going to be able to redo the roof. While I was watching this tour, she also was telling us I think it was the head of the museum was saying that they've also got some renovations that they'd like to do to the museum because of things where they realized that, wallpaper isn't as accurate as it should be, things like that they'd like to be able to do, but obviously won't be able to do until after they fix the roof. So it's a lovely little museum. They also have a really lovely gift shop online that you can definitely donate to. Again, a lot of really cool virtual programs. That's another great way to support the museum. Or you can just sponsor a roof tile for them. But definitely a cool place, and definitely one that is in need of your help this season.
Yes. And then in closing, I wanted to also highlight another museum that I love. This one is in London. It is Museum of London Docklands. Um, I think I went to this 3 times. Last time I was in London. It is honestly my favorite museum. I personally think that it beats out the British Museum as being the best museum of London. Um, it has a really large collection of mudlarking finds, which is like my big thing. So things that they have found in the Thames that mudlarkers have donated. Um, it is really a museum that's more focused on archaeology and the archaeological finds of London. And so a lot of their stuff in their gift shop reflects that. So you can buy some really cool gift gift bags and jewelry and merchandise inspired by hoards, Roman hoards that have been found and other archaeological finds. And it's just a really neat museum. I definitely should not have gone through their museum gift shop online because it made me want to buy a bunch of things because I'm very much obsessed with their merch. They also have really nice tea and biscuits if you ever actually make it there in person. But I would really just, if you are looking for a museum, they have some digital exhibits that you can look at. And if you feel inclined, make a donation. They are a museum that is free to attend. So help them keep the lights on once they're allowed to, because I think they are also in tier 4.
Can I just say that one of the things that I've missed most in quarantine, and this might be like a weird me thing, but is museum cafes.
I miss it so much.
I miss museum cafes. I miss museum gift shops. I miss just hanging out at a museum. That is probably the main thing other than movie theaters, which is very on brand for this podcast, that I'm excited to get back to whenever, life is a little bit more normal.
Yes. But that does bring us to the end of our last episode of 2020.
Which is crazy. Thank you guys so much for listening to our 15th episode of Petticoats and Poppies, History Girls at the Movies. It has been such a bright spot in our year to do this podcast and get to spend time sharing our love for period drama with all of you listeners.
And we would love to hear from you on social media and to hear what you think of The Man Who Invented Christmas. We'd also love to hear what your favorite Christmas movies are.
You can find us on social at HGATM Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can find Maggie at Maggie of the Town, and you can find me at Nicole Ackman 16.
You can listen to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, the Earglue Media website, and Audible. If you like what you hear, don't forget to give us a rating over on Apple Podcast or on Podchaser. Every other episode, we will be reading our reviews, so please be sure to leave us one if you would like to be featured.
And we'll be back soon with another exciting episode in the new year, so keep an eye out for that as we continue to look at period films from a history and film perspective. Until then, stay safe and healthy. And to everyone who celebrates it, Merry Christmas. And to everyone else, Happy New Year.
God bless us, everyone. You've been listening to Petticoats and Poppies,
History Girls at the Movies.
Dear Andre, what a splendid party. A prologue for a bright new year.